I really feel like that when we understand who we are and whose we are, and we get our identity.
Joel Osteen is known worldwide for his sermons, books, and massive church influence. But behind his public image is a personal story that has always drawn curiosity. His wife, Victoria Osteen, recently made an unexpected statement about their marriage that quickly caught public attention and sparked intense discussion online. What led to this revelation, and why is it causing such a stir now? In this video, we break down the story behind the couple's journey and the surprising announcement everyone is talking about. The woman behind the megachurch empire. Before the fame, the cameras, and the massive global following, Victoria Osteen was just a woman living a simple, grounded life, far away from the spotlight. And yet, her story would eventually become deeply connected to one of the most influential ministry empires in the world. Born Victoria Eloff in 1961 in Texas, she didn't grow up surrounded by fame or religious influence. Her early years were ordinary, shaped more by work and independence than anything tied to public ministry. Long before she became associated with Lakewood Church, she worked in retail and later explored opportunities in the beauty industry. At that time, her life was focused on building stability, not stepping into a public platform. But everything shifted when she crossed paths with a young man named Joel Osteen. He wasn't the global preacher people know today. Back then, he was still finding his place inside his father's church, carrying ambition, but not yet the massive influence that would later define his name. Their meeting didn't feel like a dramatic movie moment at first, but something about their connection slowly began to change everything. As their relationship developed, Victoria found herself pulled into a world she never originally planned for. Interestingly, she wasn't immediately drawn to ministry life. In fact, she was more focused on her own career path and creative independence, even working behind the scenes in television production. The idea of stepping into church leadership wasn't something she imagined for herself. But life has a way of shifting direction when you least expect it. By 1987, their relationship reached a turning point that would change both of their futures forever. On April 4th, 1987, they got married, marking the beginning of a partnership that would eventually grow far beyond marriage alone. It became a shared journey that would evolve into leadership, influence, and global recognition. And just when it seemed like their story was settling into a quiet beginning, something unexpected started to emerge behind the scenes, a shift that would soon pull Victoria deeper into a role she never planned for, and set the stage for everything that followed at Lakewood Church. The relationship, marriage, and rise of a public power couple. At first glance, Joel Osteen and Victoria Osteen's story sounds almost too perfect to be real. A young man quietly trying to find his place in ministry. A young woman focused on her own independence, not looking for anything tied to religion or church life. Two completely different paths that somehow collided at just the right moment. But what happened next wasn't instant romance or a dramatic love-at-first-sight moment. It was slower, more natural, almost unplanned, the kind of connection that builds without either person fully realizing how important it will become later on. When they first met around the mid-1980s, Joel was still far from the global figure people recognize today. He was working behind the scenes at Lakewood Church, still under the shadow of his father's leadership, trying to figure out his own direction. There was ambition, yes, but not yet the spotlight. Victoria, on the other hand, was living a life completely outside that world. She was independent, career-focused, and not particularly drawn to ministry or church leadership. In fact, her early professional life revolved around retail work and creative roles, including time in television production. She enjoyed structure, freedom, and building something for herself. So when their paths crossed, it wasn't some instant fairy tale explosion. It started quietly. Conversations, familiarity, curiosity, and slowly, something began to shift. Joel, known even then for his calm personality and steady presence, was drawn to Victoria's confidence and independence. There was something about her that stood out, something grounded and real. Victoria, meanwhile, began to notice a different side of Joel too. He wasn't loud or overly aggressive in personality, but there was a quiet certainty in the way he carried himself, a sense that he was building toward something bigger. even if it wasn't fully visible yet. Still, nothing rushed forward. Their connection developed step by step, almost like life was testing whether this was real or just temporary chemistry. And then, somewhere along that journey, things deepened. Their relationship eventually moved into something more serious. But even then, Victoria wasn't immediately stepping into the world of ministry or public life. She still had her own direction, her own goals, and her own identity outside of church leadership. But being close to Joel meant slowly being exposed to a world she hadn't planned to enter. A world that would eventually pull her in more than she expected. By April 4th, 1987, everything reached a defining moment. Joel and Victoria got married in a ceremony that wasn't designed for fame or attention. There were no massive headlines at the time, no global spotlight, just a meaningful union between two people who believed they were starting a shared life together. But what they didn't realize yet was that this marriage wasn't just the beginning of a personal relationship. It was the foundation of something much larger. Something that would eventually grow into one of the most recognized ministry partnerships in the world. In the early years of their marriage, life was still relatively normal. They were adjusting not only to being husband and wife, but also to the growing responsibilities around Lakewood Church. At that time, the church was not the global megachurch it is known as today. It was still developing, still evolving, still finding its identity. Then came a major turning point. When Joel's father passed away in 1999, everything shifted. Suddenly, Joel was pushed into a leadership role he had not fully stepped into before. The weight of expectation grew heavier overnight. The responsibility was no longer theoretical. It was real, immediate, and unavoidable. And this is where Victoria's role began to quietly change. At first, she wasn't fully drawn into church leadership. She had her own comfort zone, her own interests, and her own sense of identity outside of the pulpit. But as the pressure on Joel increased, so did the expectations around their partnership. Slowly, without dramatic announcements or sudden decisions, Victoria began to step into a more active role at Lakewood Church. What started as support eventually evolved into leadership. Over time, she transitioned into co-pastor alongside Joel, helping shape not only the direction of the ministry, but also the emotional tone of its message. Her presence became more visible, her voice became more recognized, and her influence began to extend beyond just being the pastor's wife. She started building her own identity within the ministry, writing books, speaking publicly, and connecting with audiences in her own style. One of her well-known works, focused on positivity and personal growth, reflected her approach to faith and life in a more relatable, practical way. Together, Joel and Victoria became more than a married couple. They became a public partnership, a shared brand, a ministry duo that millions of people around the world would come to recognize. But with visibility came attention, and with attention came pressure. Because as their influence grew, so did public scrutiny. Not everyone viewed their success with admiration alone. Questions began to surface, observations were made, and slowly, small criticisms started building into larger conversations about their lifestyle, their leadership, and their public image. Behind the polished photos, public appearances, and inspirational messages, a different layer of their story was beginning to form. One that wasn't just about success, but also about controversy, perception, and the challenges of living life in the public eye. And while everything may have looked stable on the surface, the truth is, not every moment in their journey was peaceful or untouched by criticism. In fact, one particular incident would soon break that image completely and pull Victoria into a situation she never expected. A moment that would spark headlines, public judgment, and a storm she had to face head-on. And that moment begins the next chapter of their story. The scandal that put Joel Osteen's wife under intense scrutiny. For years, Victoria Osteen had been known as part of a polished and inspirational public image. She was the co-pastor of one of the most influential churches in the world, a speaker, an author, and the wife of Joel Osteen. But in 2005, that carefully maintained image was suddenly shaken by an incident that no one saw coming. It didn't happen in a church. It didn't happen on stage. It happened in one of the most ordinary yet unpredictable places imaginable, an airport. Victoria was at George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, preparing to board a flight. Like any normal traveler, she was moving through the usual routines of air travel. But this routine moment quickly turned into something far more complicated than anyone could have expected. Reports later claimed that an issue arose between Victoria and a flight attendant regarding seating arrangements and her travel situation involving her dog. What exactly triggered the disagreement depends on who tells the story. Some accounts describe it as a simple misunderstanding that escalated under stress. Others paint it as a more heated exchange that got out of control. But what is clear is this: the situation did not stay quiet. At first, it was just an argument inside the airport, a brief moment of tension that could have easily been forgotten. But that was before her identity became the center of attention. Because this wasn't just any passenger involved in a disagreement. This was Victoria Osteen, wife of Joel Osteen, one of the most recognized religious leaders in the United States. And once that detail entered the picture, everything changed almost instantly. What could have remained a small airport dispute suddenly became public news. Word spread quickly, and soon the incident was being discussed beyond airport walls. Media outlets picked up the story, and what started as a private disagreement turned into a national conversation. And, as often happens in high-profile cases, the narrative began to grow beyond the fact. Some reports sensationalized the situation, portraying Victoria in a negative light. Headlines questioned her behavior. Commentary pieces speculated about entitlement, privilege, and how public figures should act in everyday situations. Social media, still growing rapidly at the time, added fuel to the fire as opinions spread even faster than verified details. Within days, the story had transformed into a full-blown controversy. For Victoria, the sudden attention was overwhelming. She was no stranger to public visibility, but this kind of exposure was different. This wasn't about church messages or inspirational talks. This was criticism, speculation, and judgment, all happening at once, and on a massive scale. What made it even more intense was how quickly the narrative formed without all sides fully being understood. Some people immediately assumed the worst. Others defended her, suggesting that the situation was being exaggerated because of who she was married to. And just like that, public opinion split in two directions. On one side were critics who believed the incident revealed a sense of entitlement. They argued that public figures, especially those in religious leadership circles, should be held to higher standards of behavior. In their view, even a small incident reflected poorly on her character. On the other side were supporters who felt the situation was being blown out of proportion. They believed that airport tensions are common and that the entire controversy was being amplified simply because of her name and her association with Joel Osteen. But regardless of where people stood, one thing was certain: the story wasn't going away anytime soon. And as the noise grew louder, Victoria found herself at the center of a storm she did not fully create, but now had to face. Behind the headlines, however, was a real human experience. A woman dealing with pressure, misunderstanding, and the weight of being constantly watched. The emotional toll of being judged in public, while trying to maintain dignity in private, was significant. Still, silence was not going to be a long-term option. As speculation continued, Victoria eventually stepped forward to address the situation. Instead of reacting with anger or defensive language, she chose a calmer approach. Her response focused on clarification rather than confrontation. She described the situation as a misunderstanding that had been exaggerated over time. She acknowledged that emotions were high during the incident and expressed regret that it escalated in the way it did. Importantly, she also extended an apology regarding how the situation affected the airport staff involved. Her tone was measured, careful, and controlled. There was no attempt to escalate the conflict further, and no effort to turn it into a public battle. And this approach began to shift the conversation. Slowly, the intensity of the backlash started to soften. While not everyone changed their opinion, many people began to reconsider their initial judgments. Some who were critical of her actions started to acknowledge that the situation may have been more complicated than it first appeared. However, just as things seemed to calm down, something unexpected began to develop behind the scenes. The incident was not entirely finished, because, as the story gained more attention, discussions started to move beyond media headlines and public opinion. Legal questions began to surface, statements were examined more closely, and what had started as an airport disagreement was now heading toward a more serious stage, one that would bring it into a courtroom. And once it reached that point, everything changed again. The trial that changed everything for Victoria Osteen. As controversy around Victoria Osteen grew, an airport dispute escalated from public backlash into a legal case. The situation moved into formal proceedings requiring evidence and testimony. Her side claimed misunderstanding and exaggeration, while the airport staff member alleged physical confrontation, presenting two conflicting versions of the same incident. As preparations for the legal process began, both sides worked to strengthen their positions. Lawyers reviewed statements, timelines, and available accounts. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency could shift perception. And in a case like this, public attention only added more pressure to both sides. Despite the growing tension, Victoria remained composed in public. She avoided unnecessary media engagement and allowed her legal team to handle most of the communication. Her approach was steady and controlled, focusing on clearing her name rather than fueling further controversy. When the case finally reached the courtroom, the atmosphere was intense. Cameras, reporters, and observers filled the space, all waiting to see how the situation would unfold. It wasn't just a legal matter anymore, it had become a public spectacle. The defense began by presenting their argument clearly. They emphasized that the incident was the result of a misunderstanding that had been amplified over time. According to their version, there was no physical aggression, only a heated exchange that was later misrepresented in public report. They portrayed Victoria as someone caught in a stressful situation that escalated quickly but did not cross the line into criminal behavior. Their goal was to separate public perception from factual evidence. The prosecution, however, presented a different narrative. They relied heavily on the testimony of the airport employee, who described the incident as more serious and claimed that Victoria had acted inappropriately during the confrontation. Their argument focused on credibility, insisting that the account of the staff member should be taken seriously. As testimony continued, the courtroom became a place of tension and scrutiny. Every statement was analyzed. Every response was questioned. The case was no longer just about what happened, but about what could be proven beyond doubt. Then came Victoria's moment to speak. Taking the stand, she addressed the court directly. Calm, composed, and deliberate, she denied the more serious allegations and maintained that there had been no physical altercation. She explained her version of events, emphasizing that the situation had been misinterpreted and exaggerated as it spread through media channels. Her delivery was steady. She did not appear defensive or emotional, but focused on clarity and honesty. That demeanor played a significant role in how her testimony was received. As cross-examination continued, the pressure intensified. The opposing side attempted to challenge her account, looking for inconsistencies or gaps in her memory of the event. But Victoria held firm, remaining consistent in her responses. Over time, the credibility of the opposing testimony also began to face closer scrutiny. Questions arose regarding the reliability of certain details, and the strength of the evidence supporting the allegations started to weaken under examination. After days of proceedings, the case finally moved toward its conclusion. The courtroom waited in silence as the final decision was prepared. The tension was heavy, with both supporters and critics waiting for resolution. Then the verdict was delivered. The court ruled in favor of Victoria Osteen, clearing her of all allegations tied to the incident and bringing months of legal and public dispute to an end. The verdict marked more than a legal win. It closed a chapter of scrutiny, speculation, and pressure. While she faced intense public attention, the outcome helped restore her reputation. As the courtroom cleared and media outlets reported the decision, the case ultimately stood as a reminder of how reputation, perception, and resilience are tested in the public eye. And as the dust finally settled, the focus shifted once again, this time back to the life she built with Joel Osteen, and the questions people still had about their journey, their marriage, and what truly lies behind the public image they present to the world. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more updates. Stay tuned for more powerful stories and don't forget to comment your thoughts below.